Welcome to a brand new episode of New Game Plus TV. New set, new me, new everything. As mentioned last week, we're going to change the format up a little bit and try something different, especially coming into the new year. And we've spent all this time with a new set, and some people are taking it a little bit more seriously than others. Yeah, okay. But what we do have is we're excited to talk about lots of cool stuff. We've got Ape Out, we've got Sekiro, we've got lots of cool stuff in this episode, as per usual. But let's go straight to something a little bit different right now. Now, one of the things that came up recently in our Discord, one of our long-term community members, Electric, has decided that he wants to watch anime out of the blue. So suddenly we all had to kind of scramble to think, what would we actually recommend for someone who was watching anime for the first time? And I mean, look, you instantly think of the classics. You think of Dragon Ball, you think of One Piece, you think of the Golden Triangles, like you think of a lot of the shonen-y kind of stuff, and trying to figure out what's going to work best as an introduction to it. So the conversation really boiled down to what we would start to recommend. And I figured it's actually a reasonable segment to say, cool, let me say to you what my recommendations would be for someone who's starting out for anime. And I guess I can give you maybe a top 3. That might be the way to go. So I would say number one of the very few that I think still works is Cowboy Bebop, because I think that it's cinematographically, whatever, it doesn't matter. It really nails what it's going for, that noir aesthetic, the future references. It's not too far outlandish. It's not too far removed from what people understand about kind of those cool sci-fi shows. So I think that's a really good one to kind of recommend people on. I think another one is One Punch Man. Now, obviously, you'd recommend Dragon Ball in most other situations, but One Punch Man condenses a lot of those Dragon Ball things as part of its shtick of, haha, we're taking the piss out of the genre. And I think that that's why it works as an introductory series really well. Not to mention the fact that first season just looks amazing. But I would argue the quintessential shonen you could recommend to nearly anyone is Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. I would argue it is the singular best self-contained shonen series that has ever been released. And I'm happy to hear why you think that I'm wrong.
One of the worst things that you can say about a game is that it is all style and no substance. Just think of every bland pixel art platformer that you've ever played. This is a label that you cannot attach to Ape Out, developed by Gabe Kazillo. The first thing that you will notice about this game is its style. The minimalist graphics and its animation, the bold colors, the soul-bass visuals that mark new levels, they all just demand your attention. Just look at it. Doesn't watching this footage make you want to know more about this game? And if the visuals don't do it, then the jazz percussion certainly will. The drums adapt to all the action on screen, becoming chaotic as you kill a screen full of enemies, calming down in the immediate aftermath. It matches the tone and style of the game entirely, and is honestly one of my favorite things about Ape Out. Mind you, there is also a video game under all of this, and it is a good one at that. You control a gorilla that is escaping captivity from a lab, war-torn jungles, and for some reason, an office building. Trying to stop you are gun-toting enemies that you can either grab and use as body shields or shove into the walls, exploding them into a very colourful pile of blood and bits. Complicating things is the fact that your ape is fragile, dying after only being shot 3 times. And indeed, the death screen will be a regular part of your game. But how stylish is that death screen though? This game is clearly inspired by Hotline Miami, but unlike that game, Ape Out is less about puzzling out the optimal path and is instead about charging forward and adapting immediately to the situation and enemies around you, something you'll have to do given that levels are procedurally generated. It is a game that demands improvisation, not unlike jazz. Ape Out can be finished in about 3 hours, but given the limited environments on offer, it's for the best that this game doesn't outstay its welcome. Which brings me back to that earlier axiom, style over substance. That does not apply to Ape Out. Each of its components, its striking visual style, its driving percussion, the frantic gameplay, they not only complement one another, but enhance each other. Ape Out is far from style over substance. Ape Out's substance is its style.
Now, you've just watched Don Ape Out a little bit, and it brings up an important point about Devolver, one of the first kind of indie game publishers that really kind of stake their reputation on curating indie games and making, I guess, their voice come through in the games that they chose. So I actually thought it was a really good idea to bring Donald in to discuss other other publishers, I should say, that have gone out of the way to kind of cultivate their own voice. Donald, thank you for joining me.
No worries, Jason. Before we go on, though, let's mellow a little bit on Devolver and how they sort of accidentally end up this position, because they were Hotline Miami was arguably it was the seed money that allowed them to become the publishing body that they are today.
Very much the case. And so it went from, so they had Hotline Miami, which was such a popular game, such a popular franchise. And then from that, they built into, I guess, kind of establishing a voice. Like they were known for those kind of edgy, there was a lot of games in that era that they made that perhaps weren't as, maybe as polished as Hotline Miami was. But I think that's what they were going for. You know what I mean?
Makes me wonder what came first: the Devolver identity, this sort of sort of punk attitude towards game production, or whether that was sort of brought upon by Hotline Miami's success.
Well,
whether Devolver became that studio, and they kind of seems like it came that way with many of the games that they published following that, and just the style that they all go for.
I think it was more a case. I think it was more a case of they saw that was one of the tones that was being produced. You know, we had at the time, obviously, I mean, you had Suda 51 was kind of coming into like prominence, and so he was doing that kind of punk rock thing for the Japanese scene. So there was a little bit of precedent around that. Let's do these, and not necessarily edgy games, but let's do these games that are a little bit kind of unpolished, a little bit punk rock in their application. And as a result, you have these great, you have these studios making these games that will fit the identity from there. But then again, we also have stuff like Gungeon, which sold 1 million copies for him as well.
Yeah, but Devolver seems to, like, you think of a Devolver game in your head, the prototypical Devolver game, it is a very stylish action game.
Yes.
And to Devolver's credit, they do deviate from that formula a bit. In the past year, you've had the Sword of Ditto, you had Minute, you had Gris, which is kind of the most un-Devolver game, this plaintive platformer about grief that's super stylized.
And you've got the Cyberpunk one coming out, they've got,
And that's where I think the Devolver style is. It is, by their own admission, art forward. It is like style above everything else, but style that feeds back into the game and the message that the game is going for.
And so, again, it brings us back to that original point about what other indie publishers can you think of that really have their own voice, if that makes sense.
The big ones that are around at the moment, we'll go through them throughout this discussion, but there is Adult Swim games. You have Annapurna, and you also Interactive, but you also have in Australia Fellow Traveller.
Yes.
Yeah, like Adult Swim games, like they are basically inspired by the channel's namesake. So they go for the games which are bizarre and funny. And this can range from games like Headlander to all the Rick and Morty games that they're publishing nowadays.
And it's funny because they've had this weird transition. So they had like Amateur Surgeon, and they were Robot Unicorn.
Yeah.
So they had these like classic meme games that had this like, here's this like stupid, like, it was almost like Tim and Eric kind of stuff. It was like, let's just do this scattergun stuff and see what sticks. Like Amateur Surgeon was like, it was that kind of comedic, ha ha ha, you're just some random dude who uses the vacuum cleaner and all this kind of stuff. And then they kind of really leaned hard into like the freemium games. That was the era. And now it seems like they've kind of pulled themselves out of that nosedive a little bit. Yeah,
and but all their games have that sort of vision of just being Adult Swim in video game form. Like you think Duck Game, you think the musical game that came out on iOS, whose name I'm blanking on. Yeah. But then you have, like, on the other side of the spectrum, you have Annapurna Interactive and Fellow Traveller, who are treading similar ground. They're going for much more narrative-focused games. Like from Annapurna, you have What Remains of Edith Finch, and Florence, which is made in Melbourne, actually.
I'll say the BAFTA-winning Florence.
Yes, the BAFTA-winning Florence. And then on Fellow Traveller, they've been leaning much harder into that direction with some of their recent games, haven't they?
Yeah, and I mean, and this was the thing. Even when they were Surprise Attack, they'd have like a few indie games that were kind of just indie games. You know what I mean? And I mean that with no disrespect. They were just like, here's an indie game that we can support. They were the local ones for Screen Sheet, things like that. But then it seems like since the shift to Fellow Traveller, it's become more about finding these experiences that they want to curate, that they want to cultivate. And the most recent one that sticks out for me is Stillness of the Wind, which is, you play this old lady living on this farm by yourself, and all your family's like moved to the city, and you keep receiving letters from them over time, and it's just you struggling with your day-to-day chores because you're an old woman, you move slow, all the world around you seems to be keeping on moving, and all these things are happening, and yet you're still on this farm, and you'll die on this farm. You know what I mean? Like this is how your life peters out, and so it's an interesting kind of reflection on that. but at the same time, it's very Stillness of the Wind. You know, like
Yes.
it's very Fellow Traveler as a result.
Yeah, and it's kind of good that you have such bold identities with these indie publishers, because it's good for both the customer and the publishers, because it allows allows developers rather to know who to go to get the game published. You're not going to release a folk album on Def Jam Records, for instance, and the same goes for consumers. They know that if they want something plaintive narrative, they go to Annapurna and Fellow Traveler. If they want balls to the wall action, they've got Devolver.
Yeah. And look, speaking of, like, hopefully the next game that Devolver releases actually gets a classification in Australia.
Just go through the right agency, they'll get there.
Ladies and gentlemen, the end is here. By the time you're watching this, the Avengers Endgame is out. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, built up over 11 years across 20 films or so, has finally come to a conclusion. And you know what? we're looking to celebrate what has been one of the most fascinating, transformative franchises, but also one of the most critical and popular ones at the same time.
Yeah.
In any case, I'm Jamie. I'm joined here by Megan, who
Hello.
also loves herself some Marvel.
That's it. I'm so glad you asked me to be part of this discussion.
Of course. So what I want to do now is I just want to talk about kind of the legacy of the MCU. Now, we'll be talking about Endgame at a later date. By the time you're watching this, it'll be out. We will be reviewing it.
Yes.
It's going to be great.
Yep.
But in any case, I want to talk to you, because how do you feel about the Marvel Cinematic Universe now that we effectively are at the end?
Well, I think it's more the most prevalent time than ever to have this conversation, because there's been, like, every couple of months there's been a really fat release that has done successfully well.
Yeah.
And it's caused waves for all the right reasons. And I think it's really exciting to talk about it now. We've just had Captain Marvel come out, which was a shocking success. You know, there was a lot of people grumbling and mumbling about it, and, you know, it did phenomenally. And I think
Who'd have thunk it? A woman could actually lead a superhero movie and actually does really well.
Yes.
Who'd have thought it, you stupid trolls?
That's pretty much my pitch here. I think people didn't think that strong female leads or diversity in their character rosters would do well, and now they've revolutionized the way, I guess, strong characters are portrayed.
Because it never started off that way, because you'd have, for the longest time, a lot of the women in the MCU films, like ScarJo,
Correct.
Black Widow, just never really felt like she did anything for the longest time. But now
even though, like, an Iron Man as well. Yeah, definitely. And Peggy.
Gwyneth Paltrow's role?
Yes.
I'm forgetting the name of the character, because she hasn't been in those films in a long time.
Correct, yeah.
Because it just feels like with all those films, like, again, there's just so many characters. It's ridiculous, like the fact that you've got a studio releasing 2 to 3 movies a year, and they're all consistently really good.
Yes.
Like, even in kind of the worst, even with kind of the lesser regarded films, at a baseline, they're all watchable. Like, you look at kind of every other superhero movie around about that time. Like, you've got, like, say, I look at a lot of the DC films released recently, and it feels like I can see what they're going for, but it's just not what people want. At least with the MCU stuff, you have a cinematic franchise that you kind of know what you're getting into, for better or for worse.
I actually kind of disagree. I think DC, like Warner Brothers, had an upper hand in terms of people were extremely familiar with Batman because they grew up with Saturday morning cartoons. And I think they had an advantage before they even started making movies, because people actually knew who the characters were. Like, for example, Star-Lord, who the hell knew Guardians of the Galaxy was?
Yeah, of course. Like,
but in terms of that, like, they really, they designed movies to be holistic as a release, and then rushed all the lore and the reason why people actually should care about it, and didn't develop characters that had multifaceted levels to them, which made them relatable. Whereas Marvel focused on making the audiences give a shit and, like, I guess, give context to everything, and they developed characters over time, which left you wanting more at the end of every movie. So whenever you saw them again, it just, like, really painted this beautiful picture and stayed true to the lore.
Because, I mean, you look at a lot of the DC stuff where they're like, we want to make a cinematic universe, but you have, like, before you got the Avengers, you had like 4 films before this. So there was at least a good 4 years of development, as opposed to DC's like, okay, we're going to do this in 3 or 2 rather. Like, we got what 2 to 3 films before we got Justice League, and let's not talk about that and the fact that they can't seem to make a Batman movie, but that's a whole other topic. Let's talk about the positives, because what's your favorite MCU film?
That's a really good question. I'm really glad you asked me. And before we actually filmed this, Jamie and I discovered we had a lot of crossover in our favorite movies. My first one that I came down to was Spider-Man Homecoming, as well as, I didn't really count this as a contender, but the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. It's an animated one, and it doesn't really fit the thing here, but I also Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor Ragnarok, all for multiple reasons.
The way I see it is, I like to me, I like the MCU films when they're not really superhero films. Like, I know it's gonna sound really weird, but I like it when they become genre films. Like, I love Captain America: Winter Soldier because it becomes a spy film towards the end of the film. It's like, that's just amazing. And then you have
Right, I like Spider-Man: Homecoming because for the first time ever, it gave a 15-year-old problems, and it was relatable, humorous, and painted a beautiful picture, and really had multifaceted elements to it.
Exactly, and then you got something like Black Panther, which is a role that you never would have seen happen before.
People were shocked,
and
yeah.
They made a genuinely amazing Black Panther film.
But also so relevant to the universe as a whole. Like, all the other movies had bits, especially in the comic book lore, Wakanda is extremely influential and important.
Yeah, and who'd have thought, like, actually, that's one other thing, like, given the fact we've had 11 years of films and these characters now have become the default depictions, have you ever thought like going back and kind of experiencing any of the comics that's kind of inspired the movies?
Absolutely. Marvel didn't really get me into comics, but I really appreciate how the Marvel movies really stay true to how like multifaceted the comics are. I mean, how does a director pick a story arc out of all the comics that have ever been made and tell it in a cinematic way without like boring people to death with all the granular information? I think what they have done so far is done a really great job of staying true and pleasing the hardcore fans as well.
I think that's kind of due to a lot to the house style, because you look at all the MCU films, like they're kind of samey where they have a villain that's not really that great and it sounds like it's not that great.
Yeah.
But for the most part, there is still kind of like they know what works.
Yeah.
They know how to distill the base of the story to make it work. I think that's kind of really impressive that even after so long, it feels like you never really get sick of it. Like, but in any case, now we're talking about the end of the MCU. Like, where do you go from here? Like, what would you want to see after this?
I see some really great opportunities to take some of these strong female protagonists and I guess different inclusive actress acting repertoires and amplifying that. So I'm thinking like Miss Marvel, get that Pakistani action going. She-Hulk with some like really crazy giant female action. I'm really passionate about that, and I think I can't wait to see where it takes it.
I don't disagree with that. Look, honestly, the way that I see it is I'm just happy with it being over. Like, I feel like at this point, like, I've done my 11 years.
Right.
I feel like I need
closure.
I feel like I just need a break. Like, no more superhero movies. Like, we're good. Like, maybe another Spider-Verse, that'd be great. Yeah. But in any case, look, we're out of time for this one. But look, we're keen to hear what you think of this. Like, what do you think about the MCU? If you let us know on Facebook, Twitter, get in touch with us. We're always willing to listen to you guys.
Yeah, hopefully you like the Avengers Endgame movie when it comes out.
Which we hope is good. We haven't seen it yet.
Fingers crossed.
Now, Sekiro is obviously shaping up to be probably one of the already contenders for Game of the Year. Everyone seems to love it, but I think the same issue that I have with it is the same issue I have with a lot of the games from Miyazaki and From Software. It is, at its core, a Soulsborne game. So I brought Matt back in to discuss that exact point. And it is a different kind of Soulsborne game. And this was always the thing. I've played Neo, and I appreciate Neo, and I played a fair bit of that. But I think the movement and the kind of the motion in that, it's a little bit more Ninja Gaiden-y than this. Like Sekiro, even at its core, even with the parries and even with all that, it still feels much more Soulsborne-y than you would think by looking at it.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things, or the big draws that I've come from playing Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, is that it feels a lot like a game. So From Software has had its hand in a lot of Tenchu games development from PlayStation 2 onwards. So they weren't exactly the pioneers, but they made a lot of Tenchu games a little bit later on throughout its course of its lifespan. And I found that it felt a lot more like they wanted to make a game similar to that, but in order to capitalize on that mainstream appeal that they've gotten over the last 7 years with Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and onwards, last decade, they had to incorporate those kinds of elements to make it a bit more digestible for the mainstream as well as the hardcore.
And I guess that is probably my core issue with it. So the big one that stands out to me is, you know, the one when you're in the Ashina Castle and you've got the guy standing at the top of the stairs, he's got the 5 riflemen around him, right? So jumping down and killing those riflemen is really tough, because obviously the way Soulsborne combat works, more than 2 enemies, you're really starting to struggle. Do you know what I mean? Especially when you're talking a boss with a bunch of other ones. So it's still, even at its core, feels like that same Soulsborne. Like, you've got to find a way to pick them off. And so then your option is either shuriken them from the roof, or like jump down, kill them, jump up. Jump down, kill them, jump up, and then fight him. But then if you lose, you got to do that again. And so it seems kind of at odds with itself sometimes when it does that. Do you know what I mean? Like, the funny part with it is, I still want to keep trying to play it, because I'm enjoying the narrative and I'm enjoying the way that it's dragging them all together. Like the setting's cool, the aesthetic's really cool. It does a much better job of kind of telling its story without going too hardcore into like finding bullshit to find the lore and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like that was always the problem I had with Dark Souls.
It feels a lot less like an excuse of like, oh, you just didn't read the item descriptions, you didn't check the Wikipedia, you didn't take a look at like 20 of these YouTube videos, which is completely fine, by the way. Having that extra supplementary information is completely fine. But it's my same argument with stuff like Halo, where it's like, you know, the narrative isn't well woven within the game. It's like you got to read a couple of novels to understand it. Like, but this in particular, one of the good draws I brought from Sekiro was, like, the narrative is a lot better. There's a lot more dialogue. They're a lot more kind of set in their ways. Like, I guess the luxury of not having a custom character and having someone who's designed from the ground up, from the studio themselves, you can have a far more involving, intimate narrative. And I think they've kind of nailed it in Sekiro.
And again, that is its strength. From watching like people play it who were previously good at Soulsborne games or good at that kind of stuff. The narrative is more driving, and even though Sekiro himself is a little bit of a Gordon Freeman, like he speaks, but it's kind of, you know, my lord, and all this kind of, you know, like, well, because people I watch it playing goddamn English for whatever reason, right? Doesn't matter. Oh, it's a different conversation.
The default is Japanese.
Yes.
Okay.
See?
As the game tells you at first. Default.
But it is that thing of, it really does have that more traditional story-driven experience, which is fine. And I think works for it and actually entices me to play it. Whereas previously, like I say, with Soulsborne, the issue I'd find is I get to thing and I'd be like, you know, I'd get there and just be like, what is this? My biggest problem, of course, is that you look at it and you think that it's going to play like a Ninja Gaiden or it's going to play like a Devil May Cry. Because I just come off Devil May Cry into that. And it is just a completely different style of game. Like, the skills aren't even necessarily translatable. And I much prefer a Bayonetta or a DMC over a Bloodborne.
Yeah, it feels like Sekiro in particular wants you to play the game in a particular way, or not in a particular way that suits you, but it's a way that they want you to play it.
Yeah.
So you've still got the areas, like you got the chest high wall cover, you've got the areas that you can scale, you can jump and do all sorts of cool acrobatics. You can cover yourself in reeds and, you know, lure enemies in and all that sort of stuff, which is completely fine. But the thing is, though, is that again, it's all just relegated to busy work. You're not using those kinds of stealth mechanics to fight the bigger bosses. You still got to hit with posture and deal those death blows.
It might take off one jar, but one thing, but it's not going to completely kill the boss.
Another big issue as well is the utility of the prosthetics too. They only seem to kind of want to be used in one particular fashion. Like you use the axe to break shields, you use the shuriken to knock people who might be suspended in the air, for example. They're like a lot of the other Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne in particular. The prosthetics seem to just have like one relegated use, and that's about it. There's no real other ways that you can utilize these sort of prosthetics or these sort of strategies. So that's a big drawback.
It is. On that note, that is the end of another episode of New Game Plus. Thank you for joining us. Hope you're enjoying the new set, the new format. If you do want to watch more, head down to newgameplus.tv, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, all of those great places. New Game Plus TV, one word, is where you will find us. The set's still a work in progress. Don't forget to join our Discord and jump in for our mailbag segment. We're filming that very, very soon, and we will see you guys next time.